This is the Eureka Copper Canyon LX 6-person tent. Now, I spent the last 24 days testing this tent, both in rainy days, sunny days, and even high 15 to 25 mile per hour winds. And as I was testing the tent, I rated it on 10 different quality categories that you can see here in order to give the tent an overall score out of 100 points. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through each of these different quality categories so you can see exactly how this tent performed, and so that I can give you my overall recommendation about who should buy this tent. So let's jump in to category number 1. The first thing to talk about is the setup difficulty. This tent has a fairly interesting setup process because it has an upper canopy that's put together with 2 cross poles which are made of fiberglass, and then it has 4 base poles on each corner that are made of metal. It is a little bit difficult to get some of the poles seated, especially when you're doing the last one of 4 on the bottom, but it isn't too difficult overall. And if you compare this to something like the REI Wonderland, which is fairly complex, this is actually a pretty easy tent to set up, but not as easy as something that's very, very simple like the Coleman Sky Dome, for instance. And so I give this an overall setup difficulty score of 5 out of 10. The second category is the internal layout of the tent. And this is probably one of the best features of this particular tent, and that's because it's just really spacious on the inside. If you look at the floor area, it has 1,200 square feet of floor area, which is very large for a 6-person tent. And the stand height, if you're one that likes to go inside of the tent and be able to walk around a little bit, is really good. It's 7 feet tall, and I'm 5'10", so you can see that I have quite a bit of headroom left if I'm inside the tent kind of walking around. And also, because of the design of this tent, this is a cabin style tent, which is different than what a lot of tents are, which is a dome style design. And that means that this tent has more vertical walls than a lot of other tents do. And that means that you have just more space on the inside to be able to move around if that's appealing to you. And so overall, the spaciousness of this tent on the inside and the internal layout is great. And I give it an 8 out of 10. Category number 3 is the sleep capacity of this tent. And so the way that I look at that as far as scoring goes is I look at how much space is on the inside compared to the rating that this tent was given. Because believe it or not, a 6-person tent of one brand and model might be bigger or smaller than a 6-person tent of another brand and model. And that's because there is no industry standard for what a 6-person tent is or what a 4-person tent is, which means these brands can label it however they like, which means it's really important to look at the actual dimensions of the tent or to watch a video like this one where we can actually get inside and put it to the test. So let's see if 6 sleeping pads will actually fit in here in a way that would allow 6 people to sleep on the inside. So as you can see, you actually can fit 6 people inside, and this might look pretty tight, especially if you're that person on the end. But if you compare this to other tents that are rated as 6-person tents, for example, one comparison would be the North Face Wawona, which is a popular 6-person tent. This one is actually significantly larger on the inside if you compare it to that one. And so, yes, I think this is good when it comes to sleep capacity. And also, if you're into more luxurious camping, here's an example of me putting inside a queen-size air mattress and also my Exped Duo sleeping pad, and you can see that both of them also fit in there with a bit of extra space to spare. So when it comes to sleep capacity, I think this tent performs quite well, and I give it an 8 out of 10. And if you're finding this video helpful so far, please do go ahead and hit the like button for me. That doesn't really cost you anything, and it's easy to do. Just turn that like button blue. It helps my channel out a ton, and it helps me to know that you want to see more videos like this one. So thanks in advance for doing that. Category number 4 is the door score, and unfortunately, this is one that is one of the worst things about this particular tent. Now, before we get into the reasons why, let's talk about what you can look at when it comes to the quality of the doors on a tent. Number 1, you can look at the number of doors. Number 2, you can look at the overall quality of the zippers. Number 3, you can look at how easy it is to use the door overall, so the experience of using the door. And then finally is the size of the door. And so let's start with the positive. Probably the best thing about this tent, and maybe the only thing I do like about it, is the size of the door. It is a pretty large door, which not every tent has, and that's really good for a tent of this size because it makes it easier to get things like a large air mattress in and out. Shifting quickly now to the downsides of this door, let's talk about the thing that I find most frustrating, and that is the experience of using the door. So a big reason for the experience of this door being so frustrating to me is that these zipper covers get snagged pretty frequently. And so I found that in opening and exiting this tent, going in and out, I got the zipper stuck pretty frequently, which is pretty annoying. And I also found that the zippers are a little bit irritating to use because you actually have to use 2 zippers to just open the door fully. And so there's an upper zipper that goes all the way down to the bottom of the tent, but then to open it horizontally, you then have to switch to another zipper and then finish the job. And that's a lot more difficult, or at least a lot more time consuming than a lot of other tents that just have one zipper that you can go all the way around in a circle shape or something of that nature. And so I found that irritating about this door. And then if you look at the zipper quality, the zipper itself, the hardware there, this does not have a YKK brand zipper, which is worth mentioning because YKK is a brand of zippers that is broadly recognized as the market leader in zipper quality, which means their zippers do tend to be better working and more durable and longer lasting. So that doesn't necessarily make this one a bad zipper, but in my testing it just didn't seem to work very well. So I'd be pretty confident saying this zipper is probably not as good as a tent that would have YKK zippers. For example, a tent that does have YKK zippers is the large REI Wonderland tent, which is new this year. And one more thing to mention about the doors on this Eureka tent is the number of doors. So it clearly only has 1 door, as you could probably see it just by looking at the front of the tent. And it is nice in a tent, especially a tent of this size that's meant to be a group or family camping tent, to have multiple doors so that people can go in and out at different sides. And so that does help out a lot, and this tent does not have that. So taking all of these considerations together, I give this tent an overall door score of 2 out of 10. Category number 5 is the storage of this tent. And if I look inside, I can see that there are 2 different storage pouches, one on the right side and one on the left side. They are technically separated in the middle, so technically you could call it 4, but they're grouped together, so I'll call it 2 here. This tent also has an upper storage shelf that goes at the top of the tent, which you might find useful. However, if we talk about the storage pouches, they are kind of in an inconvenient location because if you're lying down, maybe you just read a book and are getting ready to go to bed and you want to stash it somewhere, you would actually have to stand up in order to put that in the storage pocket up above the tent. Whereas a lot of other tents have those storage pockets very near to the bottom of the tent so that you can reach it while you're sitting or lying down. And so that's kind of inconvenient for the storage options in this tent. I will give this tent a little bit of the benefit of the doubt because it is so large on the inside compared to a lot of other 6-person tents that if you just want to stash some gear on the inside, you'll have a bit of extra space to do that in comparison to other brands. I also think it's worth mentioning that this tent does not have any external storage space. For example, it doesn't have a vestibule on the outside that allows you to store gear outside of the rain, but not inside of the main body of the tent, under a little like rain fly vestibule that you do see in other tent models. And so that's also something to consider. So overall, taking these things into consideration, I would give the storage of this tent a score of 3 out of 10. Category number 6 is the weatherproofing, which is probably one of the most important things to look at when you're looking for a new tent. And I did test this tent in multiple days of rainy weather, multiple days of really nice sunny days like today, and also multiple days of really high 15 to 25 mile per hour winds. And in this little segment here, I want to focus on how it performed in the high winds and how it performed in the rain. Let's start with the high winds because I think that this one is going to blow your mind a little bit. So this tent literally blew away in the winds during my testing. Now to be fair, it didn't have any gear inside at this point. So if you had some heavy gear on the inside, that could have helped prevent this from happening. But the tent was staked down at this time. So that is something to pay attention to. And I think part of the reason that this tent blew away while others didn't that I was testing at the same time is the cabin style design of this tent, which means the walls are more vertical, making it more likely to catch wind, kind of like a parachute, compared to other dome style tents that tend to shed the wind a little bit better. And so if you want to make sure that you're going to buy a tent that is going to do well in high wind areas, then you should think twice before getting this one. When it comes to the wind, a much more minor annoyance that I experienced with this tent is that the little extra pole that goes across to support the awning did blow out during the wind at 1.2, so I had to come and fix that along the way. Now let's talk about the rain. So it did rain multiple days during my testing, and some of the days it was really heavy rain, and I was actually a little bit surprised how well this tent did in the rain. And the reason I say surprised is because if you look at the windows of this tent and how they seal up, it's not done with a zipper, it's actually done with multiple little hooks, which made me think, hey, this is gonna be more likely to leak than a tent that has zippers on it, right? But actually it did really well in the rain testing and it didn't seem to leak at all, at least not that I noticed. And if I compare that to a tent that does have those zippered doors, but is a less expensive tent, such as a Coleman Sky Dome, this actually performed quite a bit better in the rain and it didn't leak at all as far as my testing goes. So overall, when it comes to weatherproofing, I would give this tent an overall score of 3 out of 10. I of course have to penalize it for that windy issues that I had of the tent just blowing away, but I do give it some credit for doing really well in my rain testing. So 3 out of 10. The next category is ventilation. And this is really important, especially if you plan to go camping in really hot weather. You want to make sure you can have that airflow going through the tent. And if we look at this tent, you can tell right away that it has really large mesh panels on each of its 4 sides. And that does allow for pretty good ventilation. And I think another thing that's good about the way this tent is designed is that you don't actually have to take the rain fly off in order to expose that mesh area. And that's not the case with a lot of other tents where the rain fly is covering up a lot of that mesh, and that kind of constricts a lot of the airflow in other brands and models of tent, but this one actually allows it even with the rain fly on. You might not be able to see it just from looking at it here, but the rain fly does cover up a little bit of mesh at the very top of the tent, and so if you wanted to, you could even create a bit more airflow if you wanted to remove the rain fly if you think there's going to be nice weather for the rest of the day or the rest of your trip. In summary, for the ventilation, I think this tent is really solid. I think it does better than some other tents like the REI Base Camp, for example, but it's not quite as good as some others like the REI Wonderland, which has really good ventilation, in particular if you take off the rain fly. But overall, really good, a bit above average, and I would give it a 6 out of 10. Category number 7 is the overall build quality of the tent. And there's a few different things I like to look at when it comes to build quality. Number 1 is the fabric, the material that the tent is made out of. Number 2 is the poles and the quality of the poles. Number 3 is the stakes that are used to stake down the tent. And number 4 is the overall architecture or the structural integrity of the tent. So let's go through each one of those. This Eureka Copper Canyon LX tent is really interesting because it kind of fits somewhere in the middle ground between your budget tent on the one side, which costs $100 to $200 or so for a 6-person size tent, and then on the other side, your $450 to $600 or so premium 6-person size tent. This one at $315 is in the middle of the road, and you can really see that when it comes to the materials that are used to make this tent, which I think is fascinating. For example, if you look at the material that the canopy and the floor of this tent is made out of, we can see that it's made out of 75 denier polyester material. And if you're not familiar with that terminology of what denier means, it's basically the thickness of the individual fibers that are knit together within the material. And typically when you have a higher number for denier, that's going to translate into a more durable material, a more durable fabric. And so this has a 75 denier canopy, which is sort of the walls in the upper part of the tent, and it has a 75 denier floor. So with more premium tents, you would have about the same 75 denier polyester canopy, but then the floor is usually going to be a higher denier material in more expensive tents. This one has 75 denier for the floor. A more premium tent like the REI Base Camp, for example, has a 150 denier material. And so kind of double the number. I think you can do the math there, but the idea is that the floor material in other tents will probably be hardier, which is worth mentioning because if you do consider getting this tent, then you might want to invest in something like a ground cloth or tarp to protect the bottom of this particular tent. Now, if we move on to the poles of this tent, there are kind of 2 sets of poles. There's the 2 poles that go over the top, and those are made out of fiberglass, which does tend to be weaker than aluminum poles that we'll find in other tents. And then the bottom poles are metal. I couldn't quite find out if it was steel or aluminum. It seems like it might be steel, but don't quote me on that. You can tell that it's metal though, it's not fiberglass. And so they will probably be more durable, but on the downside, these 4 corner poles actually have already started showing signs of rust even after just my couple of weeks of testing here. Third, probably my least favorite thing about how this tent is put together is actually the stakes. The stakes of this tent are just laughably bad. And in putting the tent up and down just a couple of times here in my testing, I actually bent several stakes already. They're very thin, they're not very good, and for a tent like this that's kind of pressing up on the bottom of the premium level, I feel like Eureka could have thrown in some nicer quality stakes. And so I'm a little bit disappointed in that. You could easily solve this problem just by going on Amazon or somewhere and buying a bundle of hardier, thicker stakes, but I don't think you should have to do that when you're buying a big 6-person family tent like this one. They should put in better quality stakes with it as it comes. And the final thing to talk about when it comes to build quality is the structural integrity of this tent and how it's designed. And we got into this, I think, a little bit when it came to weatherproofing. But if you look at this tent, it's a cabin style tent, as I mentioned, and you compare it to something like the REI Base Camp, which is an incredibly strong, well-designed tent that is very good at wicking the wind and weather. and you compare it to this tent, it's just not gonna hold up as well. I think the individual components of this tent are pretty good, but because of the cabin style design, if you compare it to something more robust and better at wicking weather, like a dome style design, this is just not quite as good. Not terrible, I would say, but not quite as good. So putting all of this together, I would give this tent an overall build quality score of 5 out of 10, which does put it kind of in the middle range. Category number 9 is the cool factor. This is where I like to reward tents that have particularly interesting, fun, or unique features, and it's where I penalize tents that have any odd, wonky, or weird in a bad way features. And this tent is, well, it's fine. I think this exact style of tent from Eureka has been in production for decades, and in fact my family had a tent very much like this from Eureka back in the 90s when I was a kid. And I don't think it's changed very much since then. And so overall, you've probably seen a tent like this at a campground if you've been camping a few times, and it's familiar, it's fine. I give it a 5 out of 10. The final category, category number 10, is packing. And specifically, I like to look at two main things when it comes to packing. Number one is how easy is it to disassemble the tent and put it back into its original storage bag? And then the second one is how compact is the tent once it's all packed up, because presumably you're gonna need to put it in the trunk of your car or SUV or what have you, and you're gonna need room to store all your other gear. And so that's important as well. Let's get into the first one. So the disassembly of this tent is fairly easy. It's not as easy as something like a Coleman Sky Dome, which is much simpler than this tent, but it is fairly easy still and much easier than something like the REI Wonderland, which is a more complex tent in my opinion. And so once you get it down and you're ready to store it back in the original storage bag, this is where things get good, because I think that this tent, the Eureka Copper Canyon LX, does have the best storage bag of any tent I've tested so far this year. And one of the reasons for that is you can roll the tent up in a quarter fold, which is one of the common ways to fold up a tent, and it fits really nicely if you do it that way. And the other thing I like about this storage bag is that it has a double zipper on the side and a Velcro on the end, which means you can peel the whole top of the bag back and just slide the tent inside, rather than having to try to stuff it into a big stuff bag, or maybe even worse, a small stuff bag. And then once you've done that, you can Velcro the end, which is almost like you have a third hand helping you move the zipper. So I think this is a really well-designed storage bag, and it works really well. Then if we look at how much space this takes in the back of a vehicle, this is a Toyota RAV4 here, and you can see that it fits in pretty nicely. I would say this is actually below average in size for a 6-person tent like this one, which is a positive sign overall for the packing of this tent. Now in summary, I would give this tent a score of 7 out of 10 for packing, because that whole experience I think was pretty good and well above average in my opinion. In summary, I gave this tent an overall score of 45 out of 100 points, which does put it very close to that middle of the road 50-point mark, which designates an average quality tent. And so if you wanted to see an example of an average quality tent, here you go. But who should actually buy this tent? In my opinion, there are two groups of people that I think would find this tent particularly appealing. Number one is groups that want to go camping with a large number of people, or perhaps maybe you have a large family and you want to make sure everyone's going to fit inside one tent. Well, this would be a good one to consider for that situation, because it has that large floor area on the inside, and it also has good ventilation, which is of course important when you have a lot of people inside of one tent. The second group of people that I think would find this appealing are those who want to try out some of the features of a more premium quality tent, but you don't want to go all the way up in price to something that's $450 to $600 or so, which is the more premium price range for a 6-person tent of this size. And if you're not yet sure if this is the right tent for you, then I highly recommend that you check out this video right here, which is a roundup that I did of the top 6 most popular family camping / car camping tents. So go ahead, check it out.